I'm Tamara. Welcome to Anything is Possible. Glad you're here again this time. I live at Lake Chapala in Jalisco, Mexico. And this week I'm going to do something really different. I'm going to show you how to make sourdough bread. Having lived in the Bay Area for a long time, and San Francisco is so famous for their really good sourdough breads. I was missing that. I used to make sourdough when I lived in Sonora, California, which is up in the Sierra foothills. And it was pretty good sourdough, but it wasn't nearly as good as what happened in the Bay Area. And I don't know that there's been a lot of research on this, but my understanding was that the yeasts in the air, when you live near a large body of water, are different than when you're living inland where it's drier and there's no large body of water. And so that is why some of the best sourdoughs in the world come from areas that they're near an ocean or near lakes or that sort of thing. So Condé Nast Traveler was one that did a comparison, and the best sourdoughs they thought came from number 1, San Francisco. Number 2 was London. Number 3 was Paris. Number 4 was New York. And number 5 was Sydney. So I thought, well, hey, I'm living here at Lake Chapala, large body of water. I'll bet you there's maybe some really good yeasts in the air. So that's why I started making it, just to see. Found out that I have a sensitivity to the sugars that are in a lot of whole grains, wheat and rye and other things. So it is sort of a offshoot from what I would call IBS. I don't actually have IBS, but I have a sensitivity to apparently what is called oligosaccharides, and that includes onions and garlic. It's the type of sugar that's contained in the starches of these grains and onions and garlic and legumes also, apparently. I just get a really terrible feeling. It's not like a life-threatening thing, but the food just feels like it's kind of sitting like almost a little chokehold. Like when you swallow and the food doesn't go down all the way, my meal feels like it's sitting there for hours. And so my body just has a real hard time digesting those things. So I'm not gluten intolerant, but I apparently have an intolerance to these particular sugars. If you have this type of intolerance, sourdough is supposed to be really well tolerated. Wheat and rye are very high in this particular type of sugar. Now, I thought, just to be sure, I would make gluten-free also. So I started out making 100% gluten-free using organic brown rice flour and organic sorghum flour and potato starch and tapioca starch, and then adding in either xanthan gum or guar gum to substitute for what would be the gluten in the bread. And you know, it tasted okay, but the taste was excellent, actually. I was very happy with the flavor, but it was very heavy. They never really rose successfully. So I decided just to go ahead and be daring, and I thought I'd make some using organic whole wheat flour for half of the flour, and then half of it would be the gluten-free. So it's what I would call a low-gluten bread. And I figured that since I'm not really gluten intolerant, that this probably would be fine. I have not tried completely with whole wheat flour yet. I use whole grains just because they're so much better for you than white. If you don't feel like bothering, and you live in the Lake Chapala area, there is a bakery here called Vicky's. And they apparently have outstanding sourdough. I have not gone in and talked to them about their process. Store-bought sourdoughs often contain a lot of other things that are not that good for you. They sometimes add yeast. They often add sugars or dairy or other things, and basic, real, honest-to-God sourdough. All it is flour, water, and salt. It's as simple as it can be. And it's a very ancient way of making bread. And it's easy. It just takes a long time is all. So it's not something that can be rushed. If you want to rush it, you're going to have to throw in commercial yeast to make it rise. Because these little guys, they take a long time. I have to say too that the weather here is always it's a good temperature for making sourdough. You don't have to worry too much about it being cold. When I lived in Sonora and there would be snowy days and cold, dreary weather, it would take a long, long time. And I often did throw commercial yeast in just because it was like it was not happening. I mean, the yeast were just asleep. They were hibernating for winter. But here at Lake Chapala, where the weather is always very nice, it rises very successfully. And the other thing that I noticed when I lived in other climates was that the actual flavor would change depending on the season a little bit. It's like different yeasts would be in the air. So they would get gathered in and collected in, and as time went on, the flavor would become more and more complex. And you keep the starter. You keep a little bit out for the starter after every batch, and so it changes depending on the yeast in the air. It changes with the weather, whether it's cool or warm. It depends a lot on just what's floating around in the air. It's really pretty interesting. First, you have to make the starter itself, which relies on whatever yeasts are in the air. It takes about 5 days to make your starter. You start it, and it takes maybe 3 days or so for the batter to actually start bubbling with the actual yeast multiplying in there. And then after you make the sourdough from start to finish, it takes about 2 or 3 days. So if you keep a little jar of starter in your fridge, you take it out in the morning and let it come to room temperature and add in a little bit of flour and water and let it start bubbling. And then you add in, you put it in another bowl and start building up the quantity so that you have approximately 2 cups of starter when you're done. And then you take a little bit of that, put it back in your jar, keep it in the fridge, and use the rest of it to go ahead and make your bread dough. So then you make your bread dough, and it takes about another day. I've found here, and that's with the weather being in the 70s during the day, it takes about 24 hours for it to actually rise to where it's really nice and bubbled up and ready to go. So you have to, it is a little bit of maintenance, not much. It's like having a little creature that you have in the refrigerator. You have to feed it about once a week. Just throw in random amount. I would say a couple of tablespoons of flour and a little bit of water and stir it up good. Put it back in the fridge, and if it gets to be too much and you haven't been using it, then you can dump some out. But my starter that I did, I followed a recipe on Ellie's Every Day. I'll put a link to that down below. It's a YouTube that shows. Doesn't matter what kind of flour you use. I used brown rice flour to do mine, but you can use anything, whether it's gluten-free or wheat. The technique is the same no matter what flour you use. I'm going to go through the process of what I do to make the bread, and what I'm going to show you is actually one that is a half whole wheat and half gluten-free flour recipe. So it would be a low gluten bread. It's definitely low FODMAP. Making it this way, there's nothing in there that should bother you at all. If you want to go gluten-free, use all gluten-free flour, but I'm telling you right now, it's not going to really rise that well. I had very little success with it. There are recipes online that I was following, and they show beautiful results, but mine never really rose that well. So the first thing I do is take this starter and stir in the solids and the liquids. From what I understand, the liquid, you can pour it off, but it actually contributes a lot to the sour flavor. But this, to activate it, you pour it into a largish bowl. And there's no need to wash the jar. It contains a lot of the bacteria that cause the sour flavor. And then I'm just dumping, it doesn't matter what flours you use. I'm using some brown rice. I've got to get more to make the bread. And then I use about half, when it comes to the bread, of wheat flour. And then you need to add water until it just makes kind of a loose batter. So that's pretty good. It's not super thick, but it's not real runny either. You just take a piece of saran. I just save this from time to time so I don't have to waste plastic. And put it over the top, and there's no rushing sourdough. It can take 24 hours easy, so could be tomorrow morning before I actually get back to making this into bread dough and forming it into loaves. It is very different dough than if you've ever made yeast bread. It comes out very differently. It's also a very sticky dough, as you'll see as we go on. So proportions don't matter a whole lot when it comes to the actual starter, but I have a couple of cups of it here. And I'll just give it a bit of a stir. What I've been using is a cup of brown rice flour, or sorghum, or any other kind of flour that you wish to use that would be gluten-free. And then I use a quarter of a cup of potato starch, 2 teaspoons of sugar, salt, close enough. Actually, more salt is actually better. Often I use a tablespoon. 3 teaspoons is 1 tablespoon. And salt, if you forget it, it totally makes the bread taste like nothing at all. I do add some guar gum. When you're reducing the amount of gluten in the bread, the guar gum acts as a structure within the dough. There's some gumminess within the bread that is what normally the gluten provides. So since you're reducing the amount of gluten in the bread, I add the guar gum just to add more structure so that you get a lighter bread. And then I do a cup of whole wheat flour. You could use white, but I just like making whole grain products. Then I never measure the water. You just want to add it until the dough starts hanging together some. A little bit more. Just enough so that it barely starts binding and hanging together. That's pretty good. I'll take a quick minute. So I got this silicone baguette pan. It's very floppy and it's mesh. I'm not sure how it's going to work, but it won't fit on my cookie sheet, so I'm just going to cut it here. So I got olive oil on my hands and roughly divide this in two. Anything that's exposed to the air dries out and then it won't rise, so put a tea towel on that to cut down on the breezes and just leave it for another 24 hours or so. Here we are next morning. we have some nice fluffy resin. Look at how nice that looks. Nice baguettes. Turn it down to about 400. If you want a real crispy crust, you can spray it with a spray bottle, but I'm not going to do that because I don't have pure water in there. It's just tap water. So, get it to baking. I had fun with this little project, learning how. It took me a few loaves of bread to actually come up with one where I was pretty happy with it. And that spurred me on to going and buying these baguette pans that are silicone so that they come out easily. And I'm going to keep making it. I also really love making English muffins. It makes excellent pizza dough. There's sourdough pancakes you can make. There's all kinds of things that you can make that are sourdough. It was really fun finding that the flavor of the sourdough here is actually pretty close to what I used to get in San Francisco Bay Area. That's it for this week. I hope you enjoyed this. Please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, share it with your friends, comment, whatever. And I will see you next week. Bye.